Sometimes the most important day of your life begins looking exactly like the worst one. Megan Parker stared at the warning notice taped to the windshield of her aging sedan and felt her stomach tighten. The payment was overdue again. She already knew that before reading the paper, but seeing it in black and white made the situation feel painfully real. If she could not come up with the money soon, she would lose the only reliable way to get to work. Megan folded the notice and slipped it into her purse before climbing into the driver's seat. The car started with its usual hesitation, and she silently thanked it for surviving one more day. At 35 years old, Megan had become an expert at surviving one more day. She worked mornings at a small diner and spent evenings cleaning offices downtown. Between the two jobs, she barely earned enough to cover rent, groceries, utilities, and the endless expenses that came with raising her 8-year-old daughter alone. Most months felt like a balancing act performed over a canyon. One unexpected bill could send everything crashing down. When Megan arrived home that afternoon, she found another envelope waiting in her mailbox. Her heart sank before she even opened it. The electric company was demanding payment. She carried the letter upstairs to the small apartment she shared with Lily. The building was old, the walls were thin, and the carpet had seen better days, but it was home. Lily sat at the kitchen table coloring pictures for school. The little girl looked up and smiled. "Mom, look what I made." Megan forced her worries aside and walked over. Lily proudly held up a drawing of a sunny house surrounded by flowers. "That is beautiful," Megan said. "Is that our house someday?" Lily nodded enthusiastically. "A big one with a garden." Megan smiled, even though her eyes felt heavy. "I would like that." After dinner, Lily went to bed while Megan sat alone at the kitchen table reviewing bills. No matter how many times she added the numbers, the results stayed the same. There simply was not enough money. She rubbed her temples and looked toward the ceiling. For the first time in years, she did not know what solution to try next. The following morning brought more bad news. Her manager at the diner informed her that business had slowed and several shifts would be reduced. Megan thanked him politely, but the words echoed in her mind for the rest of the day. Reduced hours meant reduced income. Reduced income meant bigger problems. By late afternoon, dark clouds covered the sky as she walked toward the downtown bus station after finishing a cleaning job. A cold wind swept through the streets. People hurried past, focused on their own destinations. Megan pulled her coat tighter and checked the time. She needed to get home to Lily. Then she noticed something unusual across the street. Near a busy intersection stood an older man who appeared confused and uncertain. While dozens of people passed him without slowing down, he remained there looking increasingly distressed. Megan hesitated. She had responsibilities waiting at home and problems of her own. Yet something about the stranger's expression made it impossible for her to keep walking. Taking a deep breath, she stepped toward the crosswalk, completely unaware that the decision she was about to make would change her life forever. Taking a deep breath, Megan Parker stepped toward the crosswalk, completely unaware that the decision she was about to make would change her life forever. The older man remained near the corner, gripping a small leather bag, while looking anxiously from one side of the street to the other. Traffic moved steadily through the intersection, and the evening rush seemed to make everything more confusing for him. As Megan approached, she noticed that he appeared disoriented rather than injured. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked gently. The man looked up, startled at first, then visibly relieved. "I am not entirely sure," he admitted with an embarrassed smile. "I seem to have lost my sense of direction." Megan offered a reassuring smile. "That happens to the best of us." The man chuckled softly. "I appreciate your kindness." Up close, he appeared to be in his early 60s. His clothes were well maintained but simple, and there was something thoughtful about his expression. Megan asked if he needed help finding an address. The man pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to her. She examined it carefully. The address was located nearly 2 miles away on the opposite side of downtown. "That is quite a distance," she said. "Were you planning to walk?" The man looked sheepish. "I suppose I underestimated how far it was." Megan glanced toward the darkening sky. Rain clouds continued gathering overhead. "Do you have anyone you can call?" she asked. The man's expression changed slightly. "Unfortunately, my phone battery died this afternoon." Megan checked the time again. Every minute mattered. Lily would be expecting her soon. Yet the thought of leaving this man alone in worsening weather did not sit right with her. "There is a coffee shop across the street," she said. Why do not we get you somewhere warm while we figure this out? The man seemed surprised by the offer. You would do that? Megan shrugged. It is not a problem. A few minutes later, they sat near a window inside the small coffee shop. Megan purchased a cup of coffee for him despite knowing she should not be spending extra money. The man thanked her repeatedly. During their conversation, she learned his name was Jonathan Reed. He spoke politely but revealed little about himself. Instead, he seemed more interested in learning about her life. Megan shared a few details about raising Lily and balancing two jobs. Jonathan listened carefully without interrupting. That sounds incredibly difficult, he said. Megan smiled faintly. Some days are harder than others. Before long, rain began falling outside. Heavy drops struck the windows while pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks. Jonathan glanced toward the storm and shook his head. I am grateful you stopped when you did. Megan waved away the comment. Anyone would have helped. Jonathan looked out the window at the crowds rushing past. I'm not sure that is true. The statement lingered in Megan's mind. Eventually, she allowed Jonathan to use her phone. After making a brief call, he seemed visibly relieved. Someone will be here shortly, he explained. Megan nodded. Her responsibility was finished. She gathered her things and prepared to leave. Before she could stand, Jonathan reached into his pocket and removed a business card. Please, he said, take this. Megan glanced at it, but did not read the details. That is not necessary. I would feel better if you did. She accepted the card out of politeness and slipped it into her purse. Moments later, a black sedan pulled up outside the coffee shop. Jonathan stood and smiled warmly. Thank you, Megan Parker. Hearing her full name caught her off guard. She did not remember telling him her last name. Then Jonathan extended his hand. I have a feeling our paths may cross again someday. Megan smiled politely, never imagining how true those words would become. I have a feeling our paths may cross again someday. Jonathan Reed's words lingered in Megan Parker's mind during the bus ride home that evening. She was not sure why. Perhaps it was the unusual confidence with which he said them, or perhaps it was because the entire encounter felt slightly different from an ordinary act of helping a stranger. Still, by the time she reached her apartment and saw Lily waiting excitedly at the window, the responsibilities of daily life quickly pushed the memory aside. The following weeks became some of the busiest Megan could remember. Her reduced hours at the diner forced her to accept additional evening cleaning assignments whenever they were available. She left home before sunrise and often returned after dark. Every dollar mattered. Some days, she barely had enough energy to finish dinner before falling asleep on the couch. Through it all, Lily remained her greatest source of motivation. The little girl rarely complained despite understanding that money was tight. One Saturday morning, while organizing paperwork at the kitchen table, Megan accidentally discovered Jonathan's business card buried inside her purse. She had forgotten about it entirely. Curious, she turned it over. To her surprise, the card contained only a name and a phone number. There was no company logo, job title, or address. That is strange, she murmured. Most business cards advertised something. This one revealed almost nothing. Lily looked up from her homework. What is strange? Megan smiled and slipped the card back into her purse. Nothing important. A few days later, another unexpected event occurred. When Megan arrived at the diner for her morning shift, her manager called her into his office. Her first thought was that more hours were being cut. Instead, he handed her an envelope. This was delivered for you. Megan frowned. For me? A courier dropped it off about 20 minutes ago. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and completely unmarked except for her name. Confused, Megan opened it. Inside, she found a handwritten note. Her heart skipped when she recognized the signature. Jonathan Reed. The message was brief. He thanked her again for her kindness and expressed hope that she and Lily were doing well. Enclosed was a gift card for a local grocery store. Megan immediately shook her head. She appreciated the gesture, but accepting gifts from strangers felt uncomfortable. Yet the note included one final sentence. Please consider this a small thank you from someone who believes kindness should never go unnoticed. Megan stared at the words for a long moment. Part of her wanted to return everything. Another part understood that Jonathan's intentions appeared sincere. The gift card would certainly help with groceries. That evening, she used part of it to purchase fresh fruit, vegetables, and several items she normally could not afford. Watching Lily's excitement at dinner made her grateful. Over the next 2 weeks, life settled back into its normal routine. Then, one rainy Thursday afternoon, Megan returned home to find a black sedan parked outside her apartment building. Her first instinct was to assume it belonged to a visitor in another unit. However, as she approached the entrance, a professionally dressed man stepped out of the vehicle and politely addressed her by name. "Ms. Parker." Megan stopped immediately. "Yes." The man offered a courteous smile. "My name is Michael Hayes. I am an attorney representing Mr. Jonathan Reed." Megan's confusion deepened instantly. "An attorney?" Michael nodded. "Mr. Reed would like to speak with you regarding a matter of great importance." Before Megan could ask another question, Michael handed her a sealed envelope. "I believe this will explain everything." "I believe this will explain everything." Attorney Michael Hayes handed the sealed envelope to Megan Parker and then politely returned to his vehicle. "Please take your time," he said before closing the door. Megan stood motionless in the rain for several seconds, staring at the envelope in her hands. Nothing about the situation made sense. She had helped an older stranger at a coffee shop only a few weeks earlier. Now an attorney was appearing outside her apartment with mysterious letters. By the time she reached her kitchen table, her curiosity had overwhelmed her hesitation. Lily sat nearby working on a school project while Megan carefully opened the envelope. Inside, she found a handwritten letter from Jonathan Reed and an invitation printed on expensive stationery. The letter immediately captured her attention. Jonathan thanked her once again for her kindness and explained that there were important matters he wished to discuss in person. He apologized for the unusual approach, but insisted that the conversation could not happen through ordinary correspondence. At the bottom of the page, he invited her to meet him at a private office downtown the following Saturday morning. Megan read the letter twice. "Mom, what is it?" Lily asked. Megan smiled uncertainly. "I am not completely sure." The next several days passed slowly. Megan considered ignoring the invitation altogether. Every logical part of her mind warned that accepting mysterious meetings with wealthy strangers was not something responsible people usually did. Yet nothing about Jonathan had ever seemed threatening. In fact, he had been respectful, thoughtful, and surprisingly sincere. Eventually, curiosity won. Saturday morning arrived bright and clear. Michael Hayes met Megan outside a professional office building located near the financial district. The lobby alone looked more expensive than any place she had ever entered. As she followed Michael toward an elevator, she became increasingly self-conscious about her modest clothes. "You look perfectly fine," Michael said kindly, somehow sensing her discomfort. Megan laughed nervously. "I do not think I belong in places like this." Michael smiled. "You might be surprised." A few minutes later, the elevator doors opened onto a private office floor. Jonathan Reed stood waiting near a large window overlooking the city skyline. His face brightened immediately when he saw her. "Ms. Parker, thank you for coming." Megan shook his hand. "You have definitely made me curious." Jonathan laughed softly. "That was not my intention, but I suppose it was unavoidable." Once everyone was seated, Jonathan became noticeably more serious. He folded his hands and looked directly at Megan. "Before we discuss anything else, I need you to understand that our meeting today has very little to do with the day we met." Megan blinked in surprise. "Then why am I here?" Jonathan exchanged a glance with Michael before answering. "Because I have been searching for someone connected to a story that began more than 40 years ago." Megan frowned. "I do not understand." Jonathan reached into a drawer and removed an old photograph. The image appeared faded with age. He carefully slid it across the desk. Megan picked it up and immediately felt confused. The photograph showed a young woman standing beside a small farmhouse. She had never seen the picture before. "Who is she?" Megan asked. Jonathan studied her reaction closely. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly the question I hoped you could help answer." Megan looked at him in disbelief. "Why would I know?" Jonathan slowly pushed another document toward her. This time it was a birth certificate. The moment Megan saw the family name printed on the page, her heart skipped. The woman in the photograph shared the same maiden name as Megan's late grandmother. The woman in the photograph shared the same maiden name as Megan's late grandmother. For several seconds, Megan Parker simply stared at the birth certificate in disbelief. The surname was uncommon enough that seeing it immediately caught her attention. She looked back and forth between the document and the faded photograph. "This cannot be a coincidence," she whispered. Jonathan Reed nodded slowly. "That is exactly what we thought." "Michael Hayes." opened a large folder filled with old records and carefully organized papers. Several months ago, he explained, Mr. Reed hired researchers to help locate surviving relatives connected to a family matter that dates back more than 4 decades. Megan listened without fully understanding. The situation felt increasingly unreal. Jonathan leaned forward. Tell me about your grandmother. Megan thought for a moment. Her name was Eleanor Parker before she married. She passed away when I was 16. Jonathan exchanged another glance with Michael. The attorney removed a second photograph from the folder. This image showed 2 young women standing together in front of a farmhouse. One of them closely resembled the woman from the first picture. Do you recognize anyone? Michael asked. Megan studied the image carefully. Something about one of the faces seemed familiar. Not familiar enough to identify, but enough to trigger old memories of family photo albums she had seen as a child. Maybe, she admitted. I'm not sure. Jonathan took a deep breath. The woman in the first photograph was named Margaret Holloway. According to our records, she was related to your grandmother. Megan blinked. I have never heard that name. Neither had we until recently, Jonathan replied. He explained that the mystery began after the death of a longtime family friend who had left behind several boxes of historical documents. Hidden among those records were references to land ownership, inheritance agreements, and family connections that had never been fully resolved. Over time, researchers uncovered evidence suggesting that a branch of the family had disappeared from official records decades earlier. Megan listened carefully as pieces slowly began fitting together. And somehow you think my family is connected? She asked. We know your family is connected, Michael said. What we do not know yet is how directly. Jonathan opened another file containing copies of census records, handwritten letters, and property maps. Margaret disappeared from public records in the early 1980s. No one ever located her descendants. Megan felt her pulse quicken. And you think I might be one of them? Jonathan nodded. Possibly. The room fell silent. Megan struggled to process the information. She had arrived expecting perhaps a thank you or a charitable gesture. Instead, she was sitting in a downtown office discussing hidden family history. Then Jonathan revealed something even more surprising. The reason this search became important is because of what Margaret inherited before she vanished. Michael slid a weathered map across the desk. Several locations had been marked in red ink. What exactly did she inherit? Megan asked. Jonathan hesitated briefly before answering. Property, mineral rights, and trust holdings that were never properly transferred after her disappearance. Megan stared at him. How much are we talking about? Jonathan smiled slightly. That is the question everyone has been trying to answer. He tapped a finger against one of the documents. The records suggest the assets could be far more valuable today than anyone realized at the time. Megan looked down at the map again. For the first time since entering the office, she began to understand why attorneys, researchers, and investigators had become involved. Yet as incredible as the story sounded, one question continued troubling her. Why are you helping with this? Jonathan's answer came immediately. Because my family has been connected to this mystery from the very beginning. Because my family has been connected to this mystery from the very beginning. Jonathan Reed's answer only deepened Megan Parker's curiosity. She sat quietly while Michael Hayes organized several additional documents across the conference table. What had started as a simple act of helping a stranger had now evolved into a story involving hidden family history, missing records, and potentially valuable assets. None of it felt real. Jonathan seemed to understand her uncertainty. If I were in your position, he said gently, I would probably be skeptical too. Megan laughed softly. Probably. Jonathan smiled. All right, definitely. The light-hearted moment eased some of the tension. Then Jonathan opened a worn leather binder that appeared older than everything else on the table. Inside were handwritten letters, photographs, and legal documents dating back decades. My grandfather was the attorney responsible for managing several family trusts connected to the Holloway estate, Jonathan explained. When Margaret disappeared from public records, many questions remained unanswered. Michael pointed toward a series of documents. The assets were placed into protected trust arrangements until a rightful heir could eventually be identified. Megan listened carefully. So for all these years nobody knew what happened to her family. Not with certainty, Michael replied. Records were incomplete. Some information was lost. Other information was simply overlooked. Jonathan removed a yellowed letter from the binder. This changed everything. He carefully handed it to Megan. The letter had been written by Margaret herself. Although parts had faded with time, several sections remained clearly readable. Margaret described leaving her hometown to start a new life after personal hardships. She mentioned wanting to protect her future children from complicated family disputes surrounding property and inheritance. Megan felt a strange connection while reading the words. Something about Margaret's determination reminded her of stories her grandmother used to tell. Strong women making difficult choices for their families. Then she noticed a specific sentence that immediately caught her attention. Margaret mentioned a daughter named Eleanor. Megan's eyes widened. My grandmother's name was Eleanor. Jonathan nodded slowly. Exactly. The room suddenly felt much smaller. For the first time, the possibility of a direct family connection seemed real. Michael produced several genealogical reports prepared by professional researchers. According to their findings, there was now substantial evidence linking Margaret Holloway to Eleanor Parker and ultimately to Megan herself. Nothing is finalized yet, Michael cautioned. But the documentation is becoming increasingly convincing. Megan sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the implications. Her entire life, she believed her family history was ordinary. Now she was learning that entire chapters had been hidden for decades. Jonathan continued explaining how the trust assets remained largely untouched through the years. The original holdings included farmland, natural resource rights, and investment accounts. Over time, some properties appreciated dramatically in value. Others generated income that accumulated inside protected trust structures. And nobody claimed any of it. Megan asked. No verified heir ever emerged, Michael answered. Jonathan looked toward the city skyline beyond the conference room windows. Until now, perhaps. Megan shook her head slowly. This is impossible. Yet, even as she said the words, the evidence sitting in front of her made denial increasingly difficult. Then Jonathan revealed another unexpected detail. There is one location we still need to investigate. He unfolded the weathered map from the previous meeting. A small area near a rural community several hours away had been circled in red ink. Researchers believe Margaret may have hidden additional documents there before disappearing from official records. Megan studied the map. What kind of documents? Jonathan smiled slightly. That is exactly what we hope to discover. Michael closed the binder and looked directly at Megan. Because if those records still exist, they may finally prove beyond any doubt who the rightful heir really is. Because if those records still exist, they may finally prove beyond any doubt who the rightful heir really is. Megan Parker spent the entire drive home thinking about Michael Hayes' words. The city lights blurred past the car window as questions raced through her mind. Just a month earlier, her biggest concern had been paying bills and keeping food on the table for Lily. Now she was learning about hidden branches of her family tree, missing inheritance records, and a mystery stretching back more than 40 years. The contrast felt overwhelming. That evening, after Lily went to bed, Megan opened an old storage box she kept in the back of her closet. Inside were family photographs, birthday cards, and keepsakes inherited from her grandmother Eleanor. She had not looked through them in years. Sitting at the kitchen table, she carefully examined each item. Most revealed nothing unusual. Then, tucked between the pages of an aging photo album, she discovered something unexpected. A folded letter. The paper had yellowed with age. Curious, Megan opened it. The handwriting belonged to Eleanor. Although the letter was addressed to no one in particular, it appeared to be a personal reflection written many years earlier. As Megan read, several passages immediately captured her attention. Eleanor mentioned her mother Margaret and described how little she knew about the family's early history. One sentence stood out more than all the others. Mother always believed there were things waiting to be discovered one day, but she never wanted the past to control our future. Megan read the lines several times. The timing felt almost unbelievable. The next morning, she contacted Jonathan and arranged another meeting. By afternoon, she sat once again inside the downtown office with Jonathan and Michael. When she presented the letter, both men reacted immediately. Michael carefully examined the handwriting. This could be extremely important, he said. Jonathan nodded, especially if it can be authenticated. As researchers reviewed the document, conversation shifted toward the location marked on Margaret's map. The property still existed. Although ownership records had changed over the years, a small abandoned farmhouse remained standing near the edge of the original land. According to historical records, Margaret had lived there briefly before leaving the area. "Do you think the documents are really there?" Megan asked. Jonathan smiled thoughtfully. "I have learned never to underestimate determined people." 2 days later, they traveled to the rural property. Megan had never visited that part of the state before. Rolling fields stretched across the landscape, and narrow roads wound through quiet countryside. The farmhouse appeared weathered but still standing. As she stepped onto the property, Megan felt an unexpected sense of familiarity. Not recognition exactly, but connection. Perhaps it was simply the knowledge that members of her family had once walked the same ground. Inside, the building contained little more than dust, old furniture, and forgotten memories. Yet Michael remained optimistic. Historical records suggested Margaret had hidden important papers somewhere before leaving. For several hours they searched carefully. Drawers, cabinets, shelves, and storage spaces revealed nothing significant. Eventually Megan wandered into a small upstairs bedroom overlooking the fields. Near the window sat an old wooden chest. It appeared ordinary at first glance. Then she noticed unusual markings carved into one corner. Curious, she knelt beside it and opened the lid. Most of the contents were personal items long forgotten by time. But beneath a stack of blankets rested a metal box sealed with a simple lock. Megan's heart began beating faster. Jonathan stepped into the room behind her. "What did you find?" Slowly, Megan lifted the box into the sunlight. None of them knew exactly what was inside. Yet for the first time since the mystery began, they all sensed they were finally standing at the edge of the truth. Yet for the first time since the mystery began, they all sensed they were finally standing at the edge of the truth. Megan Parker carefully carried the metal box downstairs and placed it on an old wooden table in the farmhouse kitchen. Dust floated through the sunlight streaming from the windows, while Jonathan Reed and Michael Hayes gathered around. For a moment, nobody spoke. The small box seemed ordinary, yet all three understood it could contain answers that had remained hidden for decades. Michael examined the lock. Fortunately, age had weakened the mechanism. After a few careful attempts, it opened without damage. Megan held her breath as the lid slowly lifted. Inside were several neatly bundled documents protected by oilcloth wrapping. Despite the passing years, the papers appeared remarkably well preserved. Jonathan gently unfolded the first bundle. Almost immediately, his eyes widened. "These are original trust records," he said quietly. Michael leaned closer. "And they are signed." One by one, they examined the contents. Property deeds, family correspondence, legal agreements, financial records. Every document seemed to fill another gap in the story. Then Megan discovered a sealed envelope labeled in elegant handwriting. The name on the front was Margaret Holloway. Beneath it appeared another line. "To my family, if these papers are ever found." Megan carefully opened the envelope. The letter inside was surprisingly emotional. Margaret explained that she had chosen to leave her former life behind to protect her daughter from ongoing disputes over family assets. She believed that wealth had become a source of division and wanted future generations to grow up free from conflict. However, she never intended for her descendants to lose their rightful inheritance forever. The documents hidden inside the farmhouse were meant to be discovered when the time was right. As Megan continued reading, tears formed in her eyes. Margaret wrote about hope, family, and the belief that kindness mattered more than money. Several passages reminded Megan of her grandmother Eleanor. The similarities were unmistakable. By the time she reached the final page, even Jonathan seemed moved by the words. Michael spent the next several hours reviewing the legal records. The evidence was overwhelming. Genealogical connections matched perfectly. Property ownership records aligned with family history. Trust documents identified descendants through specific inheritance provisions. Every major question that had puzzled researchers for years suddenly had answers. Finally, Michael set down the last document and smiled. "I believe we have it." Megan looked at him nervously. "Have what?" "Proof." Jonathan exhaled slowly, as though releasing years of uncertainty. "Complete proof." Megan struggled to process what that meant. "So the mystery is over?" Michael nodded. "As far as the legal questions are concerned, yes." Then he opened a folder containing updated financial evaluations prepared by experts. The numbers inside immediately caught Megan's attention. She blinked once, then twice, convinced she had misunderstood. The combination of property holdings, trust assets, mineral rights, and accumulated investments represented far more than she ever imagined possible. Not millions beyond reason, but enough to transform generations of a family. "This cannot be real," she whispered. Jonathan smiled warmly. "That seems to be your favorite sentence." Megan laughed despite her emotions. "Because things like this do not happen to people like me." Jonathan's expression softened. "Perhaps they do." The drive home felt completely different from any drive Megan had ever taken. Yet what occupied her thoughts most was not the fortune itself. Instead, she kept thinking about the chain of events that brought her there. A difficult week. A stranger standing alone near an intersection. A simple decision to stop and help. Without that moment, none of this would have happened. As she pulled into her apartment parking lot, Lily ran outside to greet her. Megan hugged her tightly. For the first time in many years, she could honestly say something she never thought possible. Their future was finally secure. Their future was finally secure. Yet in the weeks that followed, Megan Parker discovered that the most meaningful part of her journey had very little to do with money. Legal reviews continued as attorneys finalized the inheritance process, but life itself remained surprisingly familiar. She still woke up early each morning. She still packed Lily's school lunches. She still walked through the same apartment hallways and greeted the same neighbors. The difference was that for the first time in years, every decision was no longer controlled by fear. The overdue bills disappeared. The constant anxiety that had followed her for so long slowly began to fade. One afternoon, Megan sat in Jonathan Reed's office overlooking the city skyline. The inheritance had been officially confirmed. Every document recovered from the farmhouse had survived legal scrutiny. Margaret Holloway's wishes were finally honored after more than 4 decades. Jonathan smiled as he handed her the final paperwork. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said. Megan looked down at the documents and thought about Eleanor. She thought about the stories she never had a chance to hear and the sacrifices she never fully understood until now. "I wish she could see this," Megan said quietly. Jonathan nodded. "In a way, she can." Several months later, Megan made a decision that surprised many people. Rather than moving immediately into a luxurious lifestyle, she chose a simpler path. She purchased a comfortable home with a large backyard for Lily. The house was not extravagant, but it was warm, safe, and filled with sunlight. For Lily, it felt like a dream come true. The first time the little girl ran through the yard, she laughed so hard that Megan found herself crying happy tears. "Mom," Lily said excitedly, "this is the garden from my drawing." Megan smiled. She remembered the picture Lily had colored months earlier at the kitchen table. Somehow, the dream had become reality. Jonathan remained a trusted friend throughout the transition. Their connection had begun through chance, but it grew through mutual respect and gratitude. Megan often reflected on how differently life might have unfolded if she had ignored the confused stranger standing near that downtown intersection. Jonathan shared similar thoughts. During one conversation, he admitted something he had never told her before. "When we first met, I had already spent years searching for answers," he said. "I never expected the person who stopped to help me would also be the person we were searching for." Megan laughed softly. "Life has a strange sense of humor." Jonathan smiled. "Sometimes it does." As time passed, Megan used part of the inheritance to establish a scholarship fund in Eleanor and Margaret's memory. She wanted other hardworking families to receive opportunities they might not otherwise have. The project became deeply meaningful to her. Every scholarship awarded felt like another chapter of her family's story being passed forward. On a bright spring afternoon, nearly a year after finding the farmhouse documents, Megan stood in her backyard watching Lily play beneath the trees. The air was warm. Birds sang from nearby branches. For the first time in a very long time, there was nothing demanding her immediate attention. No overdue notices. No impossible choices. No fear about tomorrow. Just peace. As she looked across the yard, she remembered Margaret.